Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends.
In episode 18, I'm joined by Ellen Voie, founder, president, and CEO of Women in Trucking, where she talks about her career, what sparked the idea for Women in Trucking, her passion for bringing more women into the industry, and how the industry has changed in terms of the value it places on diversity and inclusion. Today we have joining me Ellen Voie, founder, president, and CEO of Women in Trucking. Thanks for joining us today, Ellen.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
I want to dive right in, but first I always ask my guests if they remember how we became friends or how we first met, and our first meeting was really unique. So should you tell the story or do you want me to?
So we were standing outside a convention center in Toronto, Canada, and I could tell that you were going to the airport because you had your luggage with you, and I had my luggage with me. And so I said, do you want to share a cab? And you said, yeah. And it was funny because I didn't even know who you were at the time. But what I do remember is I said, whoever gets off last has to pay for the cab. And I think you got off last, so I didn't have to.
You remember it exactly right. And I remember thinking, who is this who bets on the price of a cab, kind of around which airline I'm taking versus her and who gets dropped off first. And then we introduced ourselves and realized that we've been wanting to get to know one another for some time. And so it was really a good chance meeting. Now, I have been on your Saturday Sirius XM radio show, and we've collaborated on a number of Run on Less events and your annual conference and so forth. Tell us a little bit about your professional career and what was the spark for you to start Women in Trucking?
Well, I'm going to go back all the way to high school, and I took shop class in high school. So I learned drafting and auto mechanics and welding and things like that. And so I was working at a steel fabricating plant in the drafting department, drawing material handling equipment. And they came to me one day and said, would you like to move into the traffic department? They were setting up their own traffic department. And I agreed. And they sent me to school for traffic and transportation management. And I learned how to read tariffs, audit freight bills, and really understand the industry as a whole. And that set my career forward in transportation. So I worked for them. And then when I started my family, I did consulting in central Wisconsin, keeping drivers and trucking companies legal, auditing freight bills and things like that. So fast forward, and I was on the board of Trucker Buddy International. And by that time I had gotten my bachelor's and my master's. And so I was hired by Trucker Buddy as their executive director in 2000. And very excited. It was a fun pen pal program where drivers sent postcards to elementary classes. But in late 2005, I was approached by Schneider, and they said, we love your energy. We love what you're doing with image programs and the industry and your background in family issues. So I was hired as manager of retention and recruiting programs. And back in 2006, a lot of companies weren't really focusing on retention as much as I felt they should have, so it was a great role for me. It was more corporate level initiatives, not necessarily, face-to-face recruiting of drivers. And at the time, Mike, I was getting my pilot's license, and I belonged to an organization called Women in Aviation. And it struck me, why wasn't there a Women in Trucking Association? What was the industry doing to support women better? So I put together a board of directors, actually hired someone to work for me with the promise that she'd be paid once I got paid. And in March of 2007, Women in Trucking was formed.
So it was an idea that formed during your time at Schneider, and then it took you getting the idea for Women in Trucking from an entirely different place, aviation. That's very cool, and I think a good lesson that maybe we can learn from here. Look to other areas of your life for ideas that you can implement in maybe the work life, or in your case, Women in Trucking.
Well, and Schneider said, figure out how to attract and retain non-traditional groups. And that included returning military, Hispanics, seniors, and women. And so when they said, focus on bringing more women into the industry, that became a passion, and it still is 14 years later.
Yeah, that's very similar to how NACFE was formed. I too helped start the organization with no funding and no pay for myself, and that that's quite similar. We both had confidence that the industry needed NACV and WIT for the reasons we're talking about. And I started this podcast a number of months ago, and I've had several amazing women join it. And I'm always tempted to ask them some questions about what it's like being a woman in trucking today and maybe throughout their career. But I got to be honest with you, I'm never quite sure how to ask. I think there's a lot of people that the events of this past summer make us really think about getting more direct and talking about these things. So, but of course, with you starting Women in Trucking, you mean exact name Women in Trucking, I can ask you a little more directly, and I'll try to do that more normally. So how is it for women in trucking, whether driving a truck or in the engineering centers or operations?
Well, I can tell you that it's changed in my lifetime, in my career. In the past, people didn't even think about women being in the boardroom or in the cab of a truck, or, it was just assumed that it was a male environment. And I always like to say, Mike, every large trucking company out there started with a man and a truck. And so, look at Schneider, look at Warner, look at Sierra England, JB Hunt. It was a man and a truck, right? We're trying to make that change. And the biggest thing is this industry has changed their opinion, and now they're seeing the value that diversity brings. And so, and also we've talked about, what women bring as drivers and safety and, with customer service and things like that. But also in the boardroom, women are being more accepted, and I'm seeing more daughters taking over trucking companies from their dads. It's not just assumed that the son is going to. So it really has changed in my career in a positive way.
And I have to believe that it's been different over the decades. So in the 90s, maybe women had to really elbow their way into conversations and into the work. And now, I think it's different. I'm involved with a lot more women on a lot of the teams than existed before, and I'm feeling a lot of benefit to that. So can you compare maybe the 1990s, 2000s, and now, the 2010s and today?
Well, there's something called a dominant norm. And the dominant norm in the trucking industry is that trucks were built for men, facilities were built for men, uniforms were designed for men, recruiting ads, attracted men. And so women had to fit into the dominant norm. But that's changing in a positive way. Now women are demanding that things are actually designed for them. I mean, the truck cab manufacturers are looking at ways to make a better fit for women and men ergonomically. And, we're finally seeing uniforms that are designed for women and facilities. I mean, talk about years ago, a shower at a truck stop was like a locker room. And, a woman, if she wanted to take a shower, if someone had to stand at the door to make sure that nobody came in. And now the shower facilities are all single units. So it doesn't really matter, what gender you are. So instead of women having to adapt to a dominant norm, as in the past, the industry is becoming much more female friendly and being much more accommodating.
I know you do an annual event, and I've been to it a number of times, and it's really, really great. I'd encourage any listeners to consider Women in Trucking's Accelerate. And this year, a few of the NACV women were on a panel talking about diversity in trucking and really the coming of electric trucks. And might electric trucks drive more women into trucking? Has your organization changed as women have become a bigger part of the industry?
Well, first of all, I will tell you that 13 years ago, I would raise my hand at every meeting when somebody was giving a presentation, and I'd say, do you have anything related to gender? Like safety statistics or fuel efficiency, Mike. I would always ask, do you have anything broken down by gender? And everyone always said, no, 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 no. So we decided that we better do some research and find some information relating to gender. And so we did. We worked with some universities. We did the Women in Trucking Index. We monitor percentage of drivers, percentage of women on boards. But now companies are coming to me and saying, hey, Ellen, we broke this down by gender, and we're finding that, female drivers have less turnover, or female drivers are, take better care of their equipment or turn in paperwork. I mean, people are coming to us and saying, we have this information, and we are watching, and we're seeing what women bring to the industry. I will tell you that a number of years ago, I would bet that most trucking companies didn't even know what percentage of their board, well, their board maybe, but their leadership team or their drivers or their dispatchers were female, because they just didn't monitor that. Well, guess what? They're monitoring it now, and everybody's on a quest to hire drivers, and they're looking at, half the population and what they can bring as a driver or a technician or, safety director or whatever, and saying, now the question is, help us better understand how we can attract and retain and promote women in this industry, because we see the value.
I think there's maybe two pieces to this. First of all, it's opening up the pool of employees. Maybe a good analogy or not, but when black athletes broke the color barriers into sports, the game improved immediately because there were just simply more talented players there in the organization, on teams. And second, women really do bring a different set of skills to the job, which will make us more successful in all of our efforts. Do you agree with all that?
Yeah. Oh, it makes total sense. And so women lead differently. Women are more collaborative and team oriented, and women drive differently. Again, women are risk averse, more risk averse than men. And that's just the way, and I'm generalizing here, but that's just the way we're wired. So when you have, let's say, a female driver in the cab of a truck who's more risk averse, she's less likely to be involved in a crash. She's less likely to be cited for something, or she's just a safer driver. And they've already proved that. The American Transportation Research Institute found that men were 20% more likely to be involved in a crash in every statistically significant area. But let's go right to the boardroom. So if you have a more collaborative person who's risk averse and takes longer to make a decision because they'll look at all the options, then if let's say you want to do an acquisition, or let's say you want to make a fast decision at the boardroom, a woman typically will say, well, let's explore all the options, and let's make sure this works for everyone. So you're bringing a different perspective, and it's not a negative thing. I mean, people make decisions differently, but one isn't better than the other. It's just, what does your environment value? And so when women bring a different conversation to the table, then you start realizing, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. So that's what diversity is all about.
We do have some similar paths. You started WIT and I NACFE. Want to compare notes kind of right here, right now in front of this audience. Ellen, what was your most satisfying thing and maybe your most challenging thing as you've been running WIT? And you share yours, and then I'll share mine.
Well, the most challenging was at the beginning, is building that credibility, because, people are like, well, why do you need a woman in trucking organization? And they really misunderstood what our goal was. And 15% of our members are men. And we're not just drivers, we're all women in the industry, from engineers to technicians, drivers, women who own trucking companies or schools. So it's all women in the industry who, that's our passion, that's our mission. So establishing yourself and getting people to understand who and what you are was the most difficult thing. But I think the most satisfying thing was a few years ago, we do a strategic planning session for 2 days every year. And I walked into the strategic planning session, and I had staff there, I had our board members there, I had our foundation representatives there. I walked in the room and I looked around the room, and I realized, wow, I've got Amazon, I've got Walmart, I've got BMO, Daimler, it's just, you look around the room and you think, this is pretty amazing, because I don't know that I would have anticipated having these wonderful organizations supporting us at such a high level. So I think to me, that was just, knowing that we achieved that level of credibility in the industry.
I would agree with that satisfaction. You know, a real tribute for NACFE was to have, big, credible companies and their leaders supporting NACFE, early on and throughout the 11 years we've been at it. Now, we know fleets are burning less fuel, saving money in emissions because we're doing the work we're doing. It's very satisfying. And I think our biggest challenge, or my biggest challenge, very specifically, has been fundraising. Many nonprofits share that challenge, I think, and we certainly have it. You and I were both in private for-profit arena for a lot of years, and that really helped us, I think. But that's I guess my unique challenge.
I think, Mike, that by representing a nonprofit, it does elevate your credibility, because when people know that you're doing this for the greater good of the industry instead of to personally, support you, then it's a little different. And so it does elevate the credibility. So, and one thing I like to say, and you probably get this too, people used to always ask me, well, how do you make money if you're a nonprofit? And I'd always say, well, I'm not a nonprofit. The organization is.
Yeah, very true. You have recently announced a succession plan at the top of Women in Trucking. And if I have it right, the organization has named a replacement or a probable replacement and a transition. Now, how is that process? And maybe what can others learn, and including me here at NACFE? But I guess for all the listeners, I don't have any plans to leave NACFE, for those of you wondering, but might be some good advice for us and others.
Well, I'm sure you had the same problem. When you work with the board of directors, they were always worried that if something happened to me, who would be the face of the organization? Who would be leading the organization? So they wanted a succession plan in place. And we've been working on this for about 3 years. And so in January of this year, I hired a vice president, Debbie Sparks, and it's going to take a few years. So I'm not going anywhere for a while. But she's got to learn the ropes. She will also take on more responsibility, increase her level of participation out in the public. And so I can start, stepping back and having a new face of the organization become visible as well. So that was the reason behind the succession planning, but I'm not going anywhere for a while.
Very good. Let me ask you this. Here in 2020, we're reminded how important diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice is in our communities and all of our work, really. And as you look at those challenges we have ahead of us, what is your advice to do better? Maybe first for women and then maybe specifically for men.
Well, first of all, for women, I say go for it. So many women who come into the industry didn't choose transportation as their first career. They somehow sidestepped into it. And I think we need to change that. We need to get women thinking about careers in transportation. But for men, we can't have women sitting around at a table talking to each other. If we don't include everyone in the conversation, we can't create change in the industry. And so I'm really proud of the fact that, half of my board of directors is men and 15% of our members are men, because you know what? We all need to be part of the conversation. And I'm going to close with this, Mike. I like to tell people we're not for women in trucking as much as we're about women in trucking. And so I would say, if you want to find out more information, go to womenintrucking.org and become a member.
Very well said, and great advice. Let's be about women in trucking. I like that, and it helps me think through the actions I'm going to take moving forward. So thanks again, Ellen, for being on the show.
Thanks, Mike.
Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends.